Everyone says, if he's not calling, it's because he doesn't care. But that's not the whole truth. Male silence isn't simple. It's symbolic. Because sometimes a man's silence isn't about you at all. Sometimes it's about the place inside him that you unknowingly touched, a place he can't name, doesn't understand, and isn't ready to face. So he goes quiet, not to punish you, not to ghost you, but to protect something he hasn't yet put into words. And yet, you stared at your phone. You wondered if you were too much or not enough. You replayed your last message, tone-policed your laughter, questioned your softness. But what if his silence didn't mean rejection? What if it meant reflection? What if your presence stirred something? Not shallow interest, but a tremor in his unconscious. And that tremor made him retreat. Not because you were wrong, but because you were real. There's something the world doesn't tell you about this kind of quiet. It's not always absence. Sometimes it's activation. If this message already speaks to something you felt but never had words for, take a moment to like this video. It tells the algorithm what your heart already knows. This matters. Let's begin. Because when a man doesn't message you, it may not be about forgetting. It may be about awakening, a kind of internal unraveling you accidentally helped begin. And in that space, you are not powerless. You are the mirror. To understand a man's silence, you cannot look only at the surface. Not the last text, not the sudden pause in conversation, not even the plans he made and didn't follow through on. You have to go underneath, into the architecture of the soul, into the unconscious patterns that Carl Jung spent a lifetime trying to name. Because the silence you feel is not just his absence. It is a mirror, reflecting not just his inner world, but your own projections. Let's start there. Projection. Jung taught us that in love, we do not see people as they are. We see them through the filter of our unmet needs, our childhood templates, our internal myths. A man doesn't fall in love with your full humanity right away. He falls in love with an image, the idea of you, the glow you carry, the emotional energy you awaken in him. And you, often unknowingly, do the same. This image, Jung called it the anima in men and the animus in women, is the inner feminine, the soul image of womanhood that lives within a man's unconscious. It holds emotion, mystery, beauty, chaos, care, all the forces our culture has taught him to suppress. When he meets a woman who reflects even a shard of that image back to him, he doesn't just see you, he sees her. The ancient symbolic feminine he spent his life trying to control, suppress, or master. But he can't master you, because you're not a tactic. You're a trigger, a mirror, a memory he didn't know he had. So what does he do? He retreats, not always on purpose, not to hurt, but to survive the rising pressure of what your presence stirs. He doesn't know that the ache in his chest is ancestral. He doesn't know that your silence reminds him of his mother's distance, or that your emotional presence confronts the version of himself he's tried to keep buried. So he disappears. And you take it personally. Of course you do. You're human. You want connection, clarity, consistency. But the deeper truth? His silence often says nothing about your worth, and everything about his initiation. Individuation, Jung said, is the process of becoming whole. It's when a person confronts the unconscious, faces the shadow, and integrates all the parts they've been hiding from. And do you know what triggers that process in many men? A woman. Not just any woman, but one who doesn't perform, doesn't chase, doesn't abandon herself in order to soothe his discomfort. The woman who reflects rather than rescues. You didn't do anything wrong, you were simply felt. And being felt, truly felt, is terrifying for a man who's spent a lifetime armoring up against it. Your softness wasn't the problem. Your clarity wasn't too much. Your emotional presence was the invitation. But he's been taught to see invitations as obligations, vulnerability as risk, and feelings as storms to be avoided. So when he stops calling, when the texts slow, when the silence stretches long into the night, he isn't necessarily detaching, he may be descending into himself, into confusion, into old wounds and outdated roles. That's the tragedy of the masculine psyche. It craves the very thing it was conditioned to reject. You may think you were forgotten, but more likely, you were formative. You became a catalyst. You see, the unconscious doesn't lie. It doesn't care about excuses or timing or fear. When the right energy touches it, it responds. And the anima, awakened in a man too soon or too deeply, can send him into emotional disarray. He won't say this, He may not even know it's happening. But the symbolic pattern is clear. He stops messaging you not always because he's moved on, but because he's been moved inward. This is not to excuse poor communication or avoidant behavior, only to offer you a deeper lens so that you stop internalizing his absence as proof of your inadequacy. He may be going silent because your presence disrupted the script, because you didn't act like the others, because you mirrored something back to him he wasn't ready to see, because your gaze penetrated a mask he wasn't yet ready to remove. And this is why your reaction matters so deeply. Because the moment you take his silence as your fault, you forget who you are. You fall out of your center and into a spiral. But when you understand the symbolic undercurrent, the truth beneath the behavior, something shifts. You stop asking, "Why isn't he calling?" And you start asking, "What did I awaken?" Now let's be clear. Not every man who goes quiet is deepening into his unconscious. Some are simply distracted, emotionally immature, or unavailable. But even then, the lesson remains. His behavior isn't about your value, it's about his capacity. A woman anchored in her own wholeness knows this. She doesn't chase the echo, she holds the mirror. Because she understands that the anima, the inner feminine, is not here to perform. She's here to provoke. And sometimes, that provocation looks like silence. If you've ever gone through this, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Your experience could give another woman the clarity she's been searching for. Let's continue. Because there's something else Jung knew that most modern advice forgets. The unconscious seeks balance. Every interaction, every attraction, every withdrawal, it's all part of the soul's desire to become whole. You are not here to fill his silence, you are here to understand what it reflects. Not all love stories are meant to be finished, but all of them can be understood. And that understanding is the beginning of power. Not the power to change him, but the power to remain yourself. Even when the phone doesn't ring, even when your inbox stays empty, even when your heart aches for something he no longer offers. Because individuation isn't about getting the man, it's about returning to the woman, the one who knew, even in the silence, "I am still whole." You weren't forgotten, you were formative. This is the truth that doesn't scream. It hums underneath, like a quiet current beneath the waves of his silence. Because you weren't just a woman he dated, messaged, or touched for a while. You were a mirror. And mirrors are not easily erased. But let's be honest about what happens on your side of the silence. The stillness isn't just external, it becomes internal. You feel the quiet like a second skin. You wait, you check, you scroll. Not just for his name, but for relief from the not knowing. You're not chasing a man. You're chasing the resolution of a story left unfinished. And somewhere deep in your nervous system, that silence begins to sound like a question. Was I too open? Too emotional? Did I scare him? Was I not enough? Too much? Nothing at all? But here's the fracture. You start answering questions he never asked. You start negotiating with your own truth to make sense of his avoidance. That's the danger of projection. You mistake your self-doubt for his intention. But he hasn't said a word. His silence isn't clarity. It's a blank canvas onto which you paint every fear, every wound, every story you've carried since you were a girl. And that's where the emotional alchemy begins. Because what if you didn't fill the silence this time? What if, instead, you stepped back and watched it breathe? What if you didn't perform worthiness? Didn't send a casual "just thinking of you" text as a placeholder for your pain? What if you didn't try to soften the space between you, but instead honored it? Because here's a truth I need you to feel. Not just hear. He's not avoiding you. He's avoiding what you mirror back to him. And that mirror isn't something you're doing, it's something you are. A woman living from her depth, who feels clearly, speaks honestly, listens closely, is not a safe encounter for a man who is still fragmented. She's a spiritual confrontation, an invitation to integrate the parts of himself he spent years avoiding. When a man meets a woman who doesn't chase, doesn't diminish herself, and doesn't contort into the shape of his comfort, he may feel drawn, then terrified. So he retreats, and you think it's rejection. But often it's recognition of you, of himself, of the space between. You weren't loud. You were luminous. You weren't needy. You were nakedly real. And that kind of realness has gravity. But here's what the world doesn't teach. Sometimes the masculine doesn't know how to stay in that gravity. He returns to his order, his logic, his solitude. Not because you were wrong, but because you were disruptive. Not because you didn't matter, but because you mattered more than he was ready for. You awakened movement. And some men, when moved, don't run toward you. They run back into themselves, into routine, into silence, into structure. This isn't always conscious, but it is symbolic. Because in myth and psyche, silence is not a passive act. It's a threshold, a symbolic doorway between who he was before he met you and who he's being called to become. You didn't demand transformation, but your presence invited it. And the tragedy is that many women, feeling the ache of that silence, abandon their own center. They chase, not the man, but the moment before the silence began. The connection they thought they had. The certainty they were just beginning to trust. But here is where the real work begins. Can you remain still inside your own storm? Can you recognize that his silence is not your script to rewrite, but a mirror asking you, will you stay true to your depth even when it is not received? Because every time you send a message just to soothe the space, every time you edit yourself to feel safe in his distance, every time you imagine that if you just said the right thing, he would come back, you hand over a power that was never meant to leave your hands. And you teach your nervous system that connection requires self-abandonment. Let that sink in. But also, let something else rise. Because there's a kind of woman who emerges from this spiral. Not bitter, not guarded, but initiated. She stops taking silence personally. She starts seeing it symbolically. She understands that when a man pulls away, it isn't always her cue to pursue. Sometimes it's her moment to return to herself, to her body, her breath, her art, her hunger, her movement, her magic. Because the feminine isn't defined by response, she's defined by rhythm. And your rhythm does not need to sync to the beat of his absence. You were not created to be paused every time he retreats. You are the river, not the rock. So when silence comes, let it be what it is, a space, a symbol, a sorting. Don't fill it, feel it, let it echo, let it teach. Let it remind you that what you're truly seeking is not a man who always replies, but a connection that honors your wholeness, even in its pauses. And one more thing, he remembers. Even if he never says a word, even if he never returns, even if he chooses someone safer, easier, quieter, he remembers the version of himself you reflected. Not your perfume, not your photos, not your perfectly crafted text, but the way your gaze made him feel seen, the way your presence made him feel exposed and also somehow known, the way your silence, when you didn't chase him, made him sit with a truth he didn't know he was avoiding. You weren't erased, you were engraved, into the space between what he feels and what he's still learning how to name. So, beloved woman, this is your invitation. Don't perform, don't prove. Don't pretend it didn't affect you. But don't collapse either, because real magnetism isn't an effort, it's an essence. And the woman who keeps her essence intact when the masculine goes quiet, she doesn't just become unforgettable, she becomes unshakable. If this message helped you return to yourself, subscribe to the channel. Because this isn't just a video, it's a journey. And you won't walk it alone. Let's keep going. You're becoming the kind of woman silence can't disturb. Let's speak plainly now, because this is the part where you usually stumble, not because you're weak, not because you're desperate, but because silence is a wound that echoes every time someone didn't choose you, didn't explain, didn't stay. And in that echo, a voice whispers, do something, say something, fix it. That voice is not your truth, it's your imprint. It's the part of you that learned love was something you had to earn, that attention was survival, that your value depended on being wanted. So when a man goes quiet, you don't just feel confused, you feel unsafe, and your nervous system scrambles to re-establish connection, not because you miss him, but because you miss the feeling of being seen. And here's the first pitfall. You text too soon. Not from presence, but from panic. You send a casual message to check in. You convince yourself it's no big deal, just friendly, just soft, but your body knows the truth. It wasn't casual, it was compensatory. It came from lack, not fullness. And the moment you do this, something sacred collapses inside you. Not because you reached out, but because you abandoned your rhythm to chase his. This is the doing energy that leaves you exhausted. The belief that if you say the right thing, ask the right question, stay cool enough, you'll pull him back. But my dear, your power is not in persuasion. It's in presence. And that leads us to the second pitfall. You seek reassurance in place of self-reconnection. You call a friend. You analyze his last sentence. You reread the messages with forensic precision. You build entire narratives around the gaps in communication. And every hour that passes without a response becomes a referendum on your worth. This is what we call emotional outsourcing, when your inner world becomes dependent on an external trigger. But true sovereignty begins when you no longer need someone else's certainty to feel your own. And then comes the third pitfall. You start performing. You post curated photos. You show up online with just the right balance of living your best life and unbothered detachment. You want him to see that you're fine, glowing, thriving. But it's not real. Not yet. Because under the surface, you're still checking, still hoping, still dancing for the invisible gaze. This performance is an old trauma ritual, a way to say, look at me, I'm still worthy, I'm still here. But real magnetism never comes from pretending. It comes from grounding so deeply into your reality that performance becomes unnecessary. Let's pause here. Because none of this is to shame you. These responses are human. They come from love, from longing, from a deep ache to feel chosen. But now that you're aware, you get to choose differently. You get to remember, his silence is not your signal to shrink. It's your invitation to expand. Because silence is not absence, it's space. And space can either be filled with fear or with freedom. This is where stoicism becomes more than a philosophy. It becomes a posture. To stand still when everything in you wants to fix, to remain open without grasping, to feel the ache and still stay rooted. Real power isn't in control. It's in your capacity to remain fully you, even when someone else steps away. A woman who holds her center during absence becomes unforgettable. Not because she tried, but because she stayed. Not stayed in the relationship. Stayed in herself. She didn't abandon her joy. She didn't pause her creativity. She didn't make his absence more real than her own presence. This is the difference between a woman who reacts and a woman who remembers. Remembers who she is. Remembers what she values. Remembers that emotional regulation is not repression, it's sacred containment. And now we arrive at the hardest, clearest line in the sand. Understanding male silence does not mean tolerating it indefinitely. Compassion is not compliance. Empathy does not equal endurance. You can understand that a man is processing and still choose not to wait in emotional limbo. You can see his wounds and still refuse to shrink yours to make him feel safe. Because being an emotionally literate woman does not mean becoming an emotional container for someone who won't do the work. You don't have to justify his withdrawal. You don't have to tolerate emotional chaos under the disguise of depth. Your job is not to decode a man's silence forever. Your job is to ask yourself, does this silence reflect who he is, or just where he is? Can I accept his rhythm without losing my own? Is my peace expanded or diminished by his presence and his absence? These are questions of discernment, not desire. Because the truth is, some men will always disappear when intimacy arrives. Not because you're unworthy, but because they are unready. And your sacred responsibility is not to wait for readiness. It is to live from wholeness. Let me remind you of something powerful. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are simply learning how to love without self-abandonment. You are remembering that your energy is not a currency to be spent earning love. It is a presence to be honored. And the man who is ready for that presence, he won't need to be chased, decoded, or managed. He'll meet you in clarity, in communication, in calm. Because you didn't come here to perform for attention. You came here to radiate from truth. So the next time silence arrives, and it will, don't fill it. Feel it. Don't chase. Choose. Don't analyze him. Anchor in you. And then, if he comes back, you'll be rooted enough to decide, is this connection aligned with the woman I've become in his absence? Or was he simply the catalyst? For your return to yourself, let that be your compass. Because every silence is a crossroads, and you are allowed to walk the one that leads back to your own center. He may never tell you. But if your presence reflected something real, he will feel the absence of what he saw in you every time he fails to find it in someone else. Not because you were perfect. Not because you never faltered, but because you were true. And truth has an echo. It lingers, even in silence, especially in silence. See, some women spend years asking, "Was I enough?" But the woman who returns to herself learns to ask a better question. Was I living from the version of me that makes me proud, even when no one is watching? Because that version, she doesn't wait to be chosen. She chooses herself, not in defiance, in devotion. She doesn't build her life around a man's absence. She builds it around her own emergence. This isn't about becoming hard or cold or unreachable. It's about becoming so whole, so rooted in your own unfolding, that no pause in a man's attention can unravel your worth. This is individuation, not just his, but yours. The path of becoming the woman who doesn't react to silence with fear, but with sovereignty. So next time he doesn't call, don't rehearse your doubt. Remember your depth. Don't ask if he's thinking of you. Ask if you're living from the version of yourself that made his soul stir. You are never forgotten. You are archetypal, and that never fades. If this message helped you return to yourself, subscribe to the channel. Because this isn't just a video, it's a journey. And you won't walk it alone.